Good morning, all, and welcome to our economics webinar this morning on the cation exchange capacity and nutrient management. My name is Dr. Cristie Preston, and I'm a senior agronomist with Nutrien. Pretty much I cover the Midwest region and located in Kansas. And with these economics webinars, we try to come up with topics and/or questions that you all have, and we really look forward to some interaction. So if you have any questions about the presentation, or if you even have any topics that you'd like us to cover, please use the Q&A down at the bottom of your screen and let us know what you're thinking. At the end of the presentation, at the end of this live presentation, you'll get the QR code that you can scan for CCA credits. But if you're not watching live, there will be a Q&A, about 5 questions that you'll need to work on and answer before you can get the CCA credits after you watch the recorded version. All right, let's get started. So again, really trying to focus on topics that are relevant to nutrient management. And one of the biggest ones that I've heard here lately is cation exchange capacity. And we'll go into a few details about how nutrients are present in soil. We'll define cation exchange capacity, or CEC, as you'll see in a lot of my slides, and what potentially affects it, including clay and organic matter content, how the soil pH will affect your CEC, and then take those kind of basic concepts and apply them to how you might use them to make soil test recommendations for potassium and other recommendations that are very practical for your on-farm production. So to start with, nutrients are present in soil as either cations or anions, and that just means what charge that they have. So cations are positively charged atoms or molecules, and some of the pretty common examples of these are nitrate, which is the NO3 minus, and I completely switched those up. So, okay, you can't give a presentation without finding some mistakes. So I'm completely sorry. My examples are switched. The positively charged atoms and molecules are like calcium and magnesium and ammonium. The negatively charged atoms and molecules would be your nitrates, your phosphorus, your chloride, your sulfates. And the cations in the soil lead to the cation exchange capacity. And we'll go into how cation exchange capacity is, why the soil has cation exchange capacity. But one of the less talked about soil properties is the anion exchange capacity, which again, sorry, my examples are switched, but the anion exchange capacity is where we're holding on to these negatively charged molecules. So the soil can have a positive charge on organic matter or on the clay particles within the soil, but in general, soils carry a net negative charge. It's measured in mill equivalents per 100 grams of soil, but typically we don't focus on this, especially here in the US. We don't focus on anion exchange capacity. We mainly focus on the cation exchange capacity, which is the number of total cations that are held on the clay and organic matter negative charges. And that might be a little confusing because I literally just said that clays have both positive and negative charges. And we'll talk about how pH can affect that. But here are the correct examples of what cations are: calcium, magnesium, potassium, ammonium, hydrogen, and sodium. All of these nutrients are added together to determine what the cation exchange capacity of the soil is. Again, it's measured in milliequivalents per 100 grams of soil. And if we're thinking about how the soil holds on to these, there is a lytropic series of how tightly each one of these is held onto the soil. So as you can see here, aluminum and hydrogen are both held on the soil complex stronger than, say, calcium, magnesium, potassium, ammonium, and sodium. And how this comes into play is if I apply a fertilizer, or if I apply, say, gypsum to the soil, if I'm oversaturating that soil with a certain nutrient, it may potentially knock these other atoms or molecules off of the soil complex because there's a stronger affiliation, or the soil is trying to reach some equilibrium. So again, if I'm applying something like, say, dolomitic lime that is high in calcium and magnesium, more than likely I could potentially bump off potassium or ammonium, or actually displace some sodium within the soil. And that's actually a good example of a practical aspect of how CEC might be used with some soil amendment processes. So when it comes to measuring CEC, again, we're measuring the positive ions that are held on a negative charge. And a lot of times this can be estimated by soil texture and color. And I've got an example here in a second, but soil testing labs can use various methods to estimate CEC. Some methods some labs use the replacement method, which is used with ammonium, and then you replace it with another cation and just measure the ammonium that's left in solution, and that's how much the soil held. But more commonly, we estimate CEC by summing up the calcium, magnesium, potassium, and hydrogen. Generally, this is slightly lower than the replacement method, but it ends up being a little more efficient for the laboratories to use. Now, with the cation exchange capacity, there's also some buffering capacity of the soil. So the soil likes to remain in equilibrium. And what that means is, as plants take up nutrients, the soil releases more nutrients into the soil solution. It likes to maintain some equilibrium. Different soils have different buffering capacities, and that can affect how nutrients how they react within the soil, but also nutrient availability to those plants. So if a soil has a low CEC, which means it's not holding on to those cations like it properly should, they can potentially leach from the soil profile if an application is made. And I keep on coming back to potassium as an example, because CEC has been found to directly affect potassium management in a lot of our farming systems. And so if a soil has a low CEC, it's got a lower ability to hold on to that potassium, it could potentially be leached from the soil profile. In general, the higher the CEC, the more cations that can be supplied to the plant. Base saturation, on the other hand, is a component of CEC in that it takes into account the basic cations that are present in the soil. When you look at cations, they're either acid forming, which are hydrogen and aluminum, that's our soil acidity. The basic cations, calcium, magnesium, potassium, and sodium, those are going to be used, added together and divided by the cation exchange capacity to get a percentage of what cations are present as the base saturation. In general, there is a relationship between base saturation and pH. As you increase your base saturation, so increasing the calcium, magnesium, potassium within the soil, you will see a general increase in pH. Now, a lot of times we have farmers ask us about how, now don't get me wrong, I'm not saying that increasing your base saturation will increase your pH, like say the liming process. It will to a certain extent, but only because it is temporarily displacing those acid forming cations like hydrogen and aluminum within the soil. So in general, you are increasing the bases. You will potentially increase the soil pH, because if you think about it, as pH increases, you're getting more OH negative charges on the soil particles, and so that will lead to greater cations that can be held on the complex. But at lower pHs, you're seeing a saturation of hydrogen ions on the soil profile or on the soil surface, and that both pluses of the hydrogens and the cations, they repel each other, and so your base saturation is not as high. So if we think about liming is a process where we are displacing the hydrogen within the soil to increase the pH. That carbonate group within the lime is actually doing some neutralization. If I'm applying, say, gypsum, calcium, if I'm applying something like gypsum and I'm overly saturating the soil with calcium, I'm potentially increasing the base saturation, and I can, on a localized matter, increase the pH just a little bit, but it's not the same process. So how CEC is affected by soil pH? Again, as we increase the pH, you see more OH, or more hydroxyl groups on the soil surface, and that carries a net negative charge, and that can increase your cation exchange capacity because you've got that net negative charge and holding on to the cations. In lower pHs, you're going to see more hydrogen on the soil surface, and those two are going to repel. But in general, as pH increases, so does CEC. Depending on your soil organic matter and your pH, you could potentially see a greater net negative charge. As you can see here, organic matter can carry a consistent charge of, say, 10%. But when we look at the pH dependent charge, if I increase my pH to, say, 8 or 7.5 or 8, depending on what crop I'm growing, I could increase my CEC. Other soils like the kaolinites, like a 1-to-1 clay that may not carry a consistent net negative charge of, say, about 5%, I can increase the CEC and the net negative charge, or increase the net negative charge and therefore the CEC, if I adjust my pH to be higher. How CEC is affected by percent clay. The higher the clay content and organic matter content, the higher the CEC. And I included this just because it does tend to pop up. So anybody studying for the CCA exam, you might potentially see this, but I haven't noticed it in the past couple of years. But we do have an example here of a soil that has 2% organic matter and 20% montmorillonite clay, and how to calculate the CEC based on those criteria. In general, as clay content increases, CEC increases, but it also depends on what type of clay is present to how much you would see an increase in CEC. Your vermiculite clays, which are 2-to-1s, may not or have the highest estimated CEC compared to the montmorillonites or the smectites. Now, this is important because as clays or as soils weather, you begin to lose more CEC. So I'm originally from Virginia, highly weathered soils that, we get ample amount of moisture every year. The soils are weathered down to 1-to-1 kaolinites in a lot of areas. We don't tend to carry that high of CEC, or the sandy soils of, say, Eastern Virginia and Eastern North Carolina, not carrying a high CEC. They require different management of certain nutrients because that soil doesn't have the capability of holding on to them. All right, soils carry a net negative charge. And why is that? Well, it's because of isomorphic substitution. Big word, just meaning that there's a replacement of one atom with another atom, that they're both the same size in the lattice structure of the soil mineralogy. I never took soil mineralogy, and I'm kind of glad I didn't, because it gets down, you get deep down in the details. But in general, the higher the CEC, the higher the net negative charge, the more cations that can be held by the soil. And again, as soils weather down from 2-to-1 clays to 1-to-1 clays, we see a change in CEC and the ability for these soils to hold on to cations. 1-to-1 clays, very little isomorphic substitution. Most likely are, if you have a net negative charge, it's due to the pH dependent side of the charge. 2-to-1 clays, lots of isomorphic substitution. This can occur in that aluminum octahedral portion of the clay. They do tend to have some pH dependent charge, but only on the edges only. Some 2-to-1 clays can expand, and we'll actually go into research that we've seen or that has been published recently on how these expanding clays can expand whenever they're wet and trap nutrients like potassium in them. And that leads to the potassium not being plant available until those soils are re-wetted after they've dried and collapsed. Again, can collapse and capture ammonium and potassium within those clay layers. That's a big issue because those nutrients are not going to be plant available under drought conditions. And we'll talk more about that here in a minute. So mica weathers to other minerals. So we start out with a 2-to-1 clay, then we have some weathering event over time. Once soils stay wet or have adequate moisture, we tend to see breakdown between those clay layers and can have edge or layer weathering. Mica eventually will end up into vermiculite, and vermiculite clays are known for hydrating and expanding, but then once they dry, collapsing down, and they can trap nutrients like potassium. So I mentioned earlier that you can estimate your cation exchange capacity based on soil texture and the color of your soil. I believe this came from Purdue with Dr. Dave Mingle, looking at the different colors of soil and how your cation exchange capacity increases as the soils get darker. So if we think about the organic, dark, deep colored soils in the Midwest, they tend to carry a higher cation exchange capacity as opposed to the light colored sands. And it makes sense, but just an example of how you might potentially estimate your cation exchange capacity. Dr. Dave Franson at North Dakota State has actually went across the entire state and mapped out the clay types to hopefully improve their potassium recommendations. And I think they actually have done a really good job. But if we're looking at the smectite to illite ratios, we see some areas in the eastern part of the state that tend to have higher smectite to illite ratios, and that is potentially affecting how the potassium reacts within the soil. To give you an illustration of an illite slash Mica clay, the potassium is the yellow circle, and it can be trapped within these clay layers within the soil mineralogy. So again, with North Dakota State, looking at how the critical level might be adjusted based on your clay types, that you looking at the map beforehand, as you increase certain clay types, you can potentially increase the amount of potassium that's trapped within those layers, and it's not plant available, especially under drought conditions. So they're finding that higher levels are needed in those levels or in those areas with a higher smectite to illite ratio. When we look at how the soil test potassium is figured, so IPNI has done several studies over the years where they look at what information goes into making a soil test potassium recommendation. And out of 30 laboratories, these are the factors that those laboratories use to make soil test potassium recommendations. And as you can see at the top, using some type of an extraction to determine soil test potassium, all of them use that. But what I found interesting more than anything was some laboratories did take further steps to look at the soil mineralogy, which are the 4 highlighted in red that could potentially affect that soil potassium. And 8 of 30 laboratories utilize CEC to adjust their soil test potassium recommendations. And I thought that was interesting that more laboratories didn't, because CEC is a soil factor that can affect potassium in such a great way that why would it not be included? But we're working towards more comprehensive, more factors that could potentially affect it. We're doing more research, trying to figure out if there is a direct correlation. And a lot of times there's not, but for a farmer, it may be ideal to at least be aware of what your soil cation exchange capacity is, to understand if you might be subject to leaching losses, or might need to increase your pH to a certain level to make sure that your soil because increasing pH could potentially help your soil hold on to more cations. But again, soil mineralogy can affect soil test potassium, and that can potentially affect how a farmer will manage their nutrients. So when we're measuring exchangeable potassium, we're really trying to we're introducing an extractant to the soil. We're trying to get a good picture of what nutrients are available to the plant. That's the whole purpose of doing the soil test. What can the plant see? Universities and laboratories have done countless numbers of years of research correlating these methods to what the plant's seeing. Because if I don't understand what the plant can see is available, and I'm sorry for anthropomorphizing plants and seeing nutrients, but if we can't accurately measure what they can see is available, that's an issue. And so further research looking at how potassium, again, these yellow circles, how they get trapped into those inner layers will affect how much potassium I'm going to have to apply this year to maximize my crop uptake. Let's see. Research coming out of Iowa looking at the different soil test methods. Some of these clays that are present in Iowa, again, if they're wet, that potassium is not being trapped within the clay layers, it's plant available. But as soon as it's dry, and we're talking about field conditions, as soon as it dries down, it's potentially caught within those clay layers, that the plant's not seeing those nutrients. Well, the same concept happens whenever I take a soil sample and I dry it down so that it can be analyzed, or if I leave it sitting, if I leave it sitting out on the table to dry right before I ship it to the lab to be analyzed, or whenever it gets to the lab and the laboratory is drying it down, that drying process is causing those clay layers to collapse. And Dr. Antonio Mellarino has found that that drying process affects what the critical levels are in Iowa. So they've determined that maybe a moist soil test is a better way of predicting potassium needs for the plant. You're not getting that soil dried down, you're keeping it moist and potentially leaving that potassium. But drying it down affects the critical level, and they've shown that higher levels are needed if you're using the moist soil test, and this tends to correlate better with what the crop's seeing and the crop response in both corn and soybeans. Again, soil test recommendations, looking at the previous soil test methods, as you can see, going from very low to low, what soil test levels fall under those categories, and how the recommendations for potassium applications, we're seeing higher recommended rates to reach those maximum yields if your soil test levels are low. The optimum range actually being 30 to 40 part per million higher to reach those maximum yields. And that's our overall goal, is to make sure that we can take a snapshot and see what nutrients are available, and so that we can help farmers apply enough fertilizer to maximize their yields based on their soil test levels. One common topic, but one topic that keeps coming up right now is the use of in-season tissue sampling to see if the plant is nutrient stressed or not. And I bring this up because the majority of the US is under some level of drought stress, or is entering the season when we're not seeing as many rains as we did in the spring, how that affects nutrient availability. So a corn plant, I believe this came from Dr. Bob Miller out of Colorado State. A corn plant can take up between 8 to 10 pounds of potassium per day. And his research is showing that farmers need to consider side dress applications of potassium, even if soil test levels are high. And it comes back to whether or not I have a certain type of clay soil within my field, or if I've had drought conditions. Because if I have high ratios like Dr. Franson found in North Dakota, if I have high smectite to illite ratios, I may potentially see more potassium tie up and need additional potassium if I'm experiencing drought conditions. So it is a good idea to utilize a diagnostic tool like InSeason's tissue sampling to see if the plant is stressed, and more than likely if I've had some type of drought stress like we have seen previously in Iowa and much of the north central region, I may not have enough potassium if I applied it, say last fall, had some type of wetting event, and then the soil's dried down, yet I'm not capable of having enough moisture right now. That potassium might be tied up. This research, I mean, they're showing still crop responses to potassium applications up to 290 part per million, even though the critical level, it's not listed here, even though the critical level may only be, say, 150 part per million or up to that 200 range in some of these Colorado soils. So at the end of the day, it's essential that you make sure that the crop has enough nutrients, because guess what? Day one, whenever you put the plant in the ground or put the seed in the ground, from that point on, you're losing yield. So if you can take care of it and make sure that you're applying enough nutrients to maximize production, that's key. All right. I feel like I went through that very fast and feel like it got technical really quickly. I guess my take-home message is cation exchange capacity. It's not going to vary so much within a field, but it is a good idea to at least have some idea of the cations that or of the cation exchange capacity that you have within your soil, to make sure that you're managing the nutrients as best as possible. And with that, I will take any questions that we might have. And again, use this opportunity to, cation exchange capacity is not something that farmers talk a lot about, but understanding the basic concepts of soil properties might potentially help out with making some decisions, especially if you live in those states where cation exchange capacity is used by the laboratories to help make potassium recommendations. But use this time to let us know if there are any topics that you would like us to cover that you might potentially be seeing. I know there's a lot of articles coming out right now of how to interpret my soil test following a drought. Many states other than Iowa do not necessarily look at different methods, like the dry method versus the wet method, but they're good questions to ask on how things might be different. When there's not a crop actively growing, you're not taking those nutrients out of the soil, but if they're under drought conditions, they may potentially be tied up. We do have one question that says, what are effective methods of side dressing potassium to standing corn plant? The easiest is probably a high clearance spreader truck using potash. There are some liquid forms available. For corn, that's probably your easiest. But again, if you're going to have to maybe tissue sample early enough to see if you're going to need potassium or need potash out there. because eventually that corn will get high enough that you won't be able to get over it. So your best bet is to potentially take tissue samples early on to make sure. I know I went out driving the other day and passed by some corn that's already, already above my head. And I think they were trying to go over it with a high clearance sprayer. And I think they were doing a good job of not knocking it down. Let's put it that way. So we do have a question in regards to the difference between extractable K, which would be your soil test potassium, and water soluble K. And the differences between those two can a lot of times be a lot different. And again, that goes back to what type of clay minerals that you have in your soil. Water soluble K is just taking soil and washing it with water and looking at how much potassium is in that sample. The extraction or the soil test methods that the laboratories use look more at, they have acids with them that help break down the clay minerals a little bit more so that they're correlated with what the plant can see. Yes, the plant sees water soluble K, but it also has other nutrients that are potentially available, which is what the extractable K or the soil test potassium is measuring. And that's kind of why you see that big difference between them. Soil tests, again, are well calibrated to what the plant may potentially see. It's not going to, unless you use really strong acids, you're not going to necessarily get all of the potassium out of that soil sample. So that, but you also don't want to do that either, because those values are not correlated to what the plant may see in the soil that day. A lot of regenerative practices are beginning to measure water soluble nutrients along with extractable. Those are what is going to be readily exchanged or readily available at that instant. Now, we've talked, I feel like I'm beating a dead horse here. We've talked a lot about how the soils have wetting and drying in the Midwest. That water soluble is not going to measure some of the potassium that is trapped either or on the soil edges or trapped within the clay layers. And so, yes, from a regenerative standpoint, maybe that is what is potentially lost this day, but it's not what it is what the plant would see, but the plant can see more whenever we're talking about nutrient management practices and how we manage our nutrients. All right, I believe that is all the questions that we have right now, and we finished a couple minutes early. We want to thank you all for coming to these economics webinars. Again, if you have a topic, please reach out at nutrien.com or follow us on Twitter, Nutrien Ltd, or on the economics site. And if you'd like to follow me on Twitter at KeyLateThis, we'd love to hear what problems that you're having, because that's what we're here for, agronomists. We want you to maximize your production as efficiently or cost efficiently as possible, while taking into account the environment and making sure that we're not overly applying nutrients. If you have any issues with the QR code or getting your CEU credits, please let us know. Again, this is recorded, and the recording will be made available on the website with a short quiz. And thank you all for coming.